So we already talked about what biological evolution is defined. Genes are the unit of heredity that is transferred from parent to offspring. Again, Darwin and Wallace in the 1800s did not know about genes. They assumed there was some sort of unit of inheritance, but they did not know it yet just at that time. So all a gene is a segment of DNA that codes for a particular trait. It codes for a particular, let's say, protein or behavior or tissue, but it's a segment of DNA that codes particular traits. So just note that come test time. And then, as I mentioned before, sexual reproduction is not something that all life undergoes. It's actually something that only occurred over the last 1.2 billion years. For over 2 billion years before that, organisms reproduce asexually, which means you have an organism, let's say a bacteria cell, and then it divides. So each one of those cells is equally the same as the predecessor. And we're going to talk about why sexual reproduction likely evolved, why it likely was adaptive, and it comes back to sexually reproductive organisms. They actually produce offspring that has greater variation than asexually producers. So if you're an asexually reproducing organism like a bacterium, and you're living in an environmental niche that doesn't change very much at all, then it's perfectly fine to just asexually reproduce. However, if that environment dramatically changes, those types of organisms that are asexually producers have less variation and are much more susceptible to going extinct if there's some sort of dramatic change in the environment. Now, on the other side, sexually producing organisms, so when you have half the genes come from your mom, half of them come to your dad, and that's why, despite the fact that you and your siblings share the exact same percentage of your DNA from your parents, you look different because each sex cell, each sperm and egg are slightly different, and that actually buffers their genes because it's enhancing that variation, and ultimately that variation, there'll be some of your offspring that will be well suited to survive amidst an ever-changing ecology. So further, Darwin's theory of adaptation and natural selection, again, it rests upon heredity, which is the transmission of these genes from one generation to the next, and variation. And again, it's that variation within sexually reproducing species which promotes this differential survival and reproductive success. So I could actually show you this real-time natural selection. I could show you that this week if we had a chance. You could take a petri dish of bacteria. You could split it into two populations and expose one petri dish to a drop of penicillin, and the other one we don't touch. That'll be our control. So that one petri dish we expose to penicillin, it'll kill most of the bacteria. We know that penicillin kills bacteria. But there will be some variation within that gene pool. And there'll be certain bacterium that will better at evading death of penicillin than others. And then what will happen, those few bacteria that survive will be the ones reproducing. So we came back in a week. The bacteria only takes about a couple hours to reproduce. So if you come back in a week and then you test the control group of the original bacteria population that has not been exposed to penicillin versus the other group that was initially exposed to penicillin, killed most of it off, but then the surviving ones got reproduced. And now we expose both of them now to penicillin. What do you know? One of them is going to be much more resistant to penicillin versus the other. That's natural selection. We've altered the environment. It favored certain individuals surviving versus others. Those that did survive reproduced, and now their genes are slightly different than the other control population. That's all natural selection is. So that's called microevolutionary change, where it's just in a short amount of time, you could actually see specific population level changes in certain traits and genes. But given enough time, given enough change, that actually leads to macroevolutionary changes, which is how you see new species arise over time. So Darwin's theory of adaptation in natural selection, again, adaptation just refers to the byproduct of how an organism was created by the process of natural selection because it served an adaptive function. So ultimately, when I say an adaptive function, that means it serves some sort of benefit to that individual, whether it's to survive or enhance reproductive success. Now, not all traits are adaptive. But on the whole, they tend to be on average. We still possess traits today that are not adaptive. We have some vestigial characteristics which reflect our artifacts of our evolutionary history, like our wisdom teeth. We don't need those. They're more of a pain, a nuisance today. We have a tailbone that doesn't really do anything, which is called a coccyx. If you look at the peacock's tail, Male peacocks have these beautiful plumes of tails. The males who have the biggest tails actually have higher rates of being killed. So evolution doesn't always promote things that enhance survival. The one caveat to that is that the male peacocks with the biggest tails, they also have the highest rates of reproductive success. So females prefer males with big tails. That enhances their reproductive success. And as a result, the peacock's large-tailed was favored despite the fact that it actually enhances them getting eaten more by predators. So we'll talk about that a little bit further. So when something is considered adaptive, again, as I mentioned before, it's another way of a metaphor of saying it's ultimately contributing to the eventual reproduction of an organism or its relatives. So, like, let's say it's adaptive for a bird to be able to fly because that's essential for them to reproduce and survive. Another misnomer about natural selection and evolution is this idea that there's some sort of goal. Now, there's no goal in evolutionary theory. It's really just a math problem. There's limited resources, there's variation of the types of traits that could arise, and there's going to be a constant push and pull based on the current environmental characteristics that will favor certain traits over others. Sometimes that will lead to more complexity over the time. Other times that could actually lead to less complexity over time. So evolution, there's nothing inevitable about natural selection and biological evolution. It always occurs on a sliding scale. So ultimately, a way of thinking about it is natural selection doesn't select what's best for a species. It does not have anything to do with what's best for a species, but rather it promotes traits which are best for an individual to survive in a particular environment. Because of the fact that those individuals who are best suited for a particular environment will out-reproduce others. Therefore, those traits will then favorably get passed on from one generation to the next, and those other traits who are not adaptive, or they inhibit reproduction, or they inhibit survival, will quickly be weeded out of that gene pool. And so here's a classic example. We have a population of beetles of the same species. There's different colors of beetles. And for some reason or another, let's say a forest became, like you see all the fires today. Let's say a forest got burnt, and now there's a lot of brown coloring in the environment, and all the green grasses went away, and now just by happenstance, the brown colors now seem to be more camouflaged, and so from a non-random chance, but it's not random now that the birds now are easier at detecting the green beetles as prey. Those green beetles carry the green genes in them. They're eaten more often, so they have less reproductive success. And then over time, the brown beetle trait will be passed on more often in comparison to the green one. And then if you go back and measure the next generation, you'll see, oh, okay, well, more brown genes are in this population than the predecessor. And then you go, well, look at, here's a micro evolutionary change event that's going on. So Darwin is famous for discovering or postulating natural selection by studying the ground finches in the Galapagos, which is an island off the coast of South America in Ecuador. And so this illustration here is going to show you how natural selection has no foresight. Again, it causes population gene frequencies to vary over time depending on that specific environment. And as I noted before, that environment is constantly changing. So biologists went to the Galapagos back in the 1970s to test some of Darwin's theories. At the time, back in, and sorry that this is so small here, maybe I can't make it bigger. So before 1977, they measured the rate of food, they measured the population size on the Galapagos of these finches, which are this little bird species here. And they had plenty of food, they had a large population, and then what do you know? It underwent a drought. And then the food stores plummeted, and also the number of bird species in the population started to plummet. Because again, the resources became scarce. That creates a strong pressure now on certain traits. So when there's some sort of environmental catastrophe, that also promotes actually accelerating the rate of evolutionary change, because now there's some event where it's going to narrow what traits are really going to be successful and all the other ones are not, and those individuals are going to die and not be able to contribute to the next generation. So before Before the drought in 1977, the average beak depth of all the average, so they surveyed, here's a nice bell-shaped curve again in statistics. You guys take that, you'll see that often. So the average beak depth was about 9.5 millimeters for these finches living on this island. Great, there's about 751 of them. Great, living well. You see there's some variation here. There's some that are smaller. You see there's some that are larger, a few outliers that are really big. And then now you have the drought. So the drought created a strong selection pressure for there's scarce foods available. And what did it favor? Well, it favored having a larger beak depth, because after the drought, only 90 birds survived. And what birds survived? It's the birds now that had the larger beak depth. So in just one generation, you see a dramatic shift from 9.5 millimeters to over 10 millimeters was the mean beak depth. So that's natural selection in action in real time. Again, these things are just like science. It's observable, it's measurable, and it's testable. And so what favored that was because that having a larger beak, you have a little bit more force and pressure. The other easy to get at foodstuffs would quickly be eaten. And so those individuals who had thicker beaks could actually get at the harder to eat at foodstuffs like seeds, where the smaller beaks individuals could not, and they eventually died out. So having a larger beak was favored, and therefore the subsequent generation was represented by larger beak depth. Again, this is a microevolutionary change. The genes were shifted from one generation to the next due to a dramatic change in the environment. And then now a certain trait is favored in 1978 that was not as much favored in 1976, where the ideal beak depth was a little bit over 9. Now the ideal beak depth is over 10. And one other thing to note is that a few years later, when the rains came back to normal, you had the normal distribution of flora in the environment. Guess what? The mean beak depth slid back to about 9.5. So here's a beautiful example of how evolution is on a sliding scale. These traits that change over time vary. So it's not ultimately going to lead to bigger and bigger beaks. Its own natural selection is only a response to the finite, limited resources that are driving competition. So if you want a little bit more information of natural selection, this is the first time you really got into natural selection, please watch this video here. It's quite good. And for those of you who may not be aware, is that Darwin is famous. He's really credited for the founding father of natural selection, even though Alfred Russel Wallace should be equally credited, because he was sitting on a mountain of evidence for over 20 years, over 700-page book that he eventually published once he realized that others, Alfred Russel Wallace, also discovered the same mechanism that he did. So then that forced him to publish it. And because it was such a convincing case, so much data, so much observations to support his view, he's credited with that discovery. And as I noted earlier, this idea of a struggle for existence, where there's more babies that tend to be produced that tend to survive. If you actually measure the average hunter-gatherer mortality rate, so how often they die, it's 38% of them die before 15 years of age. So another thing to note about evolution is the way you measure it. It's not just about producing babies. It's about the number of offspring you produce that live long enough to become sexually mature and reproduce themselves, because therefore they're going to influence the subsequent generation gene pool. So you have almost 40% of all individuals dying before the age of 15. So when you're complaining about how hard you have it in today's world, just think that how lucky you are to be living in a industrialized, wealthy, technologically sophisticated environment, because half of you likely would have died before you're 15 years of age. Similarly, infant mortality is 30 times greater among hunter-gatherers, and child mortality is 100 times greater than it is in the United States. So these are the conditions in which our ancestors lived for the majority of our species' existence. But there are certain individuals who that variation created stronger babies over others, and those stronger babies are the ones that survived the reproductive maturity, and we were all descended from those, right? That's why we're here, because our ancestors were successful at evading death and reproducing. So another feature of natural selection is, again, adaptation. So a feature or organism created by the process of adaptation just means a feature or an organism created by the process of natural selection. Now, I like to use this example of the human eye because there's some miscommunication that some people would argue that the human eye is an example in favor of, let's say, an intelligent designer because the human eye is so complex. Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a beautiful example of actual how natural selection works in real time. Natural selection does not happen with great leaps and bounds. It happens on average with gradual, slow changing over time. And so if that was the case of why the human eye is the way it is, we should be able to predict in the animal kingdom that there was a series of intermediate steps from low sophistication to moderate sophistication to high sophistication that eventually led to the human eye in our ancestry. And again, this is testable. We could see if there's any other intermediate types of eyes out there that would help us understanding how the human eye may have evolved to be the way it is. And I also love this example because, as you see here, I'm wearing glasses. I'm sure some of you watching this are wearing glasses. We like to use the creationists and intelligent design advocates like to use the human eye example, despite the fact that obviously the eye is not perfectly designed, given that I had to use corrective lenses. So if you look at the human eye in comparison to others, you see that there's all types of variation of the optic of the eye. So as a vertebrate, we have some very simplistic versions. We have more complex versions like you see in eagles, for instance. And as an animal, that we have a huge amount of variation. So the human eye is nothing special. There's a bunch of intermediate steps that biologists have identified about 40 different types of eyes that have evolved over time, which ultimately gets back to a central core component of adaptation. Adaptation is a series of intermediate steps. It can only work with the current gene pool, what's available. So that's why you don't see these huge leaps and bounds. So it's just a slow tinkering effect of those genes that are available. So that let's say that basic form of eye led to a little bit of survival advantage. All right, then it gets a little bit more sophisticated with some mutation, a little more sophisticated, and eventually leads to the complex eye that we have today. So it did not just spring into existence. There should be evidence of a cumulative process of every step of the eye getting a little bit more sophisticated along the way, and that's what you do see in the animal kingdom. Now, from a creationist or intelligent design perspective, they have this idea that the eye could have been only created by a designer. Now, designers can go back to the drawing board and engineer something to be optimized. And you look at the human body, and you can quickly identify that we are not optimized. Evolution produces traits that are good enough because it can only work with what was available in the gene pool in the predecessor. So it has a limited amount of biological information it can work with. It tinkers with that based on differential survival and reproductive success. And then over enough change, you get some new interesting features arising. So the eye it didn't just spring into existence. The basic chemistry that make up the light sensitive cells of the eye is shared across the animal kingdom, which is not surprisingly. And natural selection acted on this time and time again. So here's a little bit more, a little bit more discussion about how natural selection relates to shaping the continuum in the change of the human eye.
Our Earth is the only known planet that wells up from deep below the planet. Amphibians had originally evolved on this supercontinent and had then travelled on each of its various fragments as they drifted apart. At the beginning of the 19th century, by an Anglican clergyman called William Paley, he said, supposing you were walking in the countryside and you picked up something like this, you would know from looking at it that it had been designed to tell the time. There must therefore be a designer, And the same argument would apply if you looked at one of the intricate structures found in nature, such as the human eye. And the only designer of the human eye could be God. Anti-evolutionists maintain that the eye would only work if it was complete in all its details. Darwin, on the other hand, argued that the eye had developed, becoming increasingly complex over a long period of time. That would only work if each stage of development was an improvement on the previous one. And today we know enough about the animal kingdom to know that that is indeed the case. Some very simple animals have nothing more than light-sensitive spots that enable them to tell the difference between light and dark. But if a patch of such spots formed even the shallowest of pits, one edge of the pit would throw a shadow and so reveal the direction of light. If the pit got deeper and started to close, then light would form a blurred image. Mucus secreted by the cells would bend the light and focus it. If this mucus hardened, it would form a proper lens and transmit a brighter and clearer image. All these different fully functional stages at different levels of complexity are found in living animals today. This single-celled creature has one of those light-sensitive spots. Flatworms have a small pit containing light spots, so they can detect the shadow of a predator. A snail's blurry vision is good enough to enable it to find its way to food. And the octopus has an eye with a proper lens and can see as much detail as we can. So the structure of the human eye does not demand the assistance of a supernatural designer. It can have evolved gradually, with each stage bringing a real advantage, as Darwin's theory demands. Natural selection, of course, requires that an animal's characteristics are handed from one generation to the next.
So also, it's important to note that traits don't just arise by happenstance. They tend to arise because it provided a advantage. So again, there's a reason why we don't see as well as an eagle, because we didn't need to survive. Us having eagle vision wouldn't really create that big of a survival differential compared to just having the eyes that we have today. So lastly, a core tenet from summarizing some of Darwin's theory here is that there's this idea of continuous variation. As we started the lecture with that beautiful imagery of all this continuous relationships between all life on this planet, there should be a continuum of variation of types. Darwin argued that this continued variation is essential for the evolution of complex adaptations, which they don't arrive by happenstance. It has to be a slightly ratcheting up effect of more complexity to get more and more complex traits at a gradual change, accumulation of these traits over time. And ultimately, this differs from this notion of discontinuity. So Darwin did not think that discontinuous variation was important in evolution because complex adaptations are likely to rise in a single jump. So X this one out, and this is really what the summary of what the Darwinian view of biological evolutionary change leads us to believe. There's another component of evolution in which, namely, that new organisms are created by small modifications of existing organisms, not by starting with a clean slate. So as I noted before, there's not some sort of engineering that is making everything perfect. It's that it's sort of the best organism you can make based on the available genes in that gene pool at a given place and time. All right, so we already pretty much covered why adaptations by natural selection are not by random chance. Just like the snail in that video with David Attenborough, having a slight sort of pit and eye likely led to enhanced survival. So that's there not by happenstance. That's also why you don't tend to have traits that don't confer an advantage. So energetics is limited for all organisms, why produce something that's very energetically costly if you don't have any utility for it? So that's also why you don't see a lot of wasted energy, a lot of wasted traits being favored by evolution. So there's also a couple more specific types of evolutionary change. There's convergent evolution, which means the evolution of similar adaptations, despite the fact that these species are not closely related. And there's divergence, which is the evolution of different adaptations by closely related species. So when you're reading about Darwin in the Galapagos Islands, he noted that the Galapagos has a series of islands. Those finches look like the finches that are native to Ecuador, but each of the islands has a slightly different ecology. And what do you know? He hypothesized, which we now know is true because we test their genes, that there's a founding population in Ecuador. A few of those members flew and migrated into those different islands. Each island had a different ecological landscape, and it favored different beak sizes changing over time. So that leads to divergence. Right? Divergence is you have a similar species, they migrate into new areas, new adaptive challenges, and then that promotes divergence of traits. The other hand, convergence is the inverse of that, where we have two distantly related species. They share a similar ecological niche, so similar adaptive challenges, and not by ancestry, but by convergent evolution, natural selection will favor similar traits evolving. And so an example of that is the marsupial versus placental wolf. So marsupial wolves and the placental wolf of Eurasia and the marsupial wolf of Australia, they look and behave extremely similar, despite the fact they live very far away on different continents. They share similar adaptations. They eat similar foods. They have similar forms of locomotion. They hunt similarly. They are exposed to similar climate. Now, a marsupial is something like, a kangaroo would be a classic example of that. So they last shared a common ancestor with a mammal like over 125 million years ago. So they're not closely related at all. And yet, how do we explain the fact that they look and behave so similarly? Well, this is a beautiful example of convergent evolution. They have similar food source that they're targeting. They have similar types of locomotion that helps them target that food. They're exposed with similar ecology, a similar niche, despite the fact they live on very different continents. And what happens? Natural selection favors those certain traits in those organisms because they inhabit a similar adaptive niche to come about. Another classic example of that are wings of a bird, a bat, or on a butterfly. So an insect is not closely related to a bird or a bat. A bird is not a mammal. And so they're not closely related either. And yet all three of those different species have wings. So this is another example of convergence. Well, they needed wings to fly, to survive. By independent evolutionary trajectories, they came to evolve similar adaptive traits. So this is called an analogous trait. So an analogous trait, like the bird and bat wings, it means they have separate evolutionary origins, but are superficially similar because they both have experienced natural selection that shaped them for a key role, which is flight. So this is different than homologies. Homo means the same. Analogous traits means they look similar superficially, but on the first glance, you'd think, well, they look similar, so therefore they must be closely related. But upon closer inspection, you see that the wing of a bat and a bird and an insect are quite different, actually made of different bones, different materials, but yet the function is the same because they were shaped for flight. Now, homology is an example of existing. So you have animals that's a mammal. All right, so mammals should share similar traits because they're more close related than any other animal. So homology, homo, means you have the same type of traits, but they've been modified to accommodate a specific type of problem, like locomotion, which means how you navigate existence. So humans are bipedal, we walk on two legs, bats fly, dolphins swim, and horses run. So we're all they run on four legs, so they're quadrupeds. So all these organisms are mammals, and not surprisingly, you look at the structures of the arm. Here we have the humerus, the upper arm, radius and ulna of the lower arm, and the phalanges, the wrist bones, the metacarpals, and the phalanges here, or metatarsals and the phalanges here. So you notice that the bones of the upper arm, lower arm, and the hands of the human are the exact same bones. Literally the exact same bones you see in a bat, a horse, and a dolphin. Well, how could that be? Well, the bones are still there because we share, again, remember, evolutionary change, you have the same template. So it doesn't just go in huge leaps and bounds, but you have the same template of genes that is slowly modifies for that particular species. And here you see that because these different species inhabit a different niche, it utilizes that same template of a vertebrate and only slightly modifies the shape of the morphology. So the bones are the same, just the shape has changed. So again, we still have a humerus here, still have a humerus here, still have a humerus here, but the shape has changed to accommodate the type of locomotion. So this is a beautiful illustration. Again, by observation, we can see, what do you know? Human skeletal system looks very similar, but just the shape has changed based off of, in comparison to other mammals. Another beautiful observation is that during early stages of embryological development, another invertebrates, so again, vertebrates have a backbone that makes a vertebrate. They're more closely related than invertebrates who don't have a backbone. And humans, along with a fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, you name it, all look nearly identical in the early stages of embryological development. We have pharyngeal gill slits, which if you're a fish eventually form gills. We have a post-anal tail, which if you're a fish or a cow or tortoise forms a tail. But when we start to develop, the genes actually turn off because we don't need a tail, we don't need gills. So during the later stages of development, the post-anal tail becomes reduced. That actually is what leads to the tailbone that we have here. And then the pharyngeal gill slits go away. But again, these early stages of development are a window into our evolutionary past that shows homology during these early stages and really shows that how we are all closely related to vertebrates. Well, I'll skip over that one. All right, and so we also have, as I mentioned earlier, not everything is adaptive. We still retain and pull along some traits that don't really, if it actually inhibited our survival over enough time, those traits, those individuals would have a dramatic reduction in reproduction, so they'd be weeded out of the population. But on some cases, these traits are pulled along through evolution from generation to the next because it doesn't have a positive or negative effect. It's just kind of neutral. So that's what vestigial structures are. So they refer to a trait or an organ which is greatly reduced from its original ancestral form or is no longer functional. So like the human appendix, we could remove that and still survive just fine. As I mentioned before, we have the coccyx with the tailbone, the wisdom teeth. And I want you guys to watch this video here because it talks a lot more about vestigial traits. Well, let's see. I'll just play it right now for you all. Why not? What is this?
Your body is a temple, but it's also a museum of natural history. Look closely and you'll see parts that aren't there because you need them, but because your animal ancestors did. No longer serving their previous function, but not costly enough to have disappeared. These remnants of our deep history only make sense within the framework of evolution by natural selection. With your arm on a flat surface, push your thumb against your pinky and tip your hand slightly up. If you see a raised band in the middle of your wrist, you've got a vestigial muscle in your forearm. That tendon you see connects to the palmaris longus, a muscle that around 10 to 15% of people are missing on one or both of their arms. It doesn't make them any weaker though. There's no difference in grip strength. In fact, it's one of the first tendons that surgeons will take out so that they can use it in reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. You can find the palmaris longus across mammal species, but it's most developed among those that use their forelimbs to move around. In primates, that means the muscle is longer in lemurs and monkeys and shorter in chimps, gorillas, and other apes that don't do a lot of scrambling through trees. It's not the only leftover muscle that we've got. Look at the three that are attached to our outer ear. We can't get much movement out of these muscles, especially compared to some of our mammal relatives, who use them to locate the sources of sounds. Presumably, this would have been quite helpful for early nocturnal mammals. In humans, you can still detect the remnants of this adaptation with electrodes. In one study, researchers recorded a spike of activity in the ear muscle cells in response to a sudden sound. Not enough to move the ear, but detectable. And you can probably guess the location of the sound based on these results. It came from a speaker placed to the left of the study subjects. So this is their left ear subconsciously trying and failing to pivot toward the sound. You can see another futile effort by our vestigial body parts when you get goosebumps. When we're cold, tiny muscles attached to our body hairs contract, pulling the hair upright, which causes the surrounding skin to form a bump. For our furry mammal relatives, the raised hair increases the amount of space for insulation, helping them stay warm. Birds can do this too. You've probably seen a puffy pigeon on a cold day. Adrenaline is one of the hormones involved in the body's response to cold temperatures, and it's also part of the fight or flight response. So it helps some animals appear larger when they're threatened. And it may be why surprising and emotional turns in music can give some people goosebumps. And then there's our tail. At the end of our spine are a set of fused vertebrae. Some people have 3, some people have 5. We call it the tailbone. It now serves as an anchor for some pelvic muscles, but it's also what's left of our ancestors' tails. Every one of us actually had a tail at one point when the basic body plan is being laid out at around 4 weeks of gestation. Human embryos closely resemble embryos of other vertebrates, and that includes a tail with 10 to 12 developing vertebrae. In many other animals, it continues to develop into a proper tail, but in humans and other apes, the cells in the tail are programmed to die a few weeks after they appear. Very rarely, though, a mutation allows the ancestral blueprint to prevail, and a human baby will be born with a true vestigial tail. The most adorable vestigial behavior is the palmar grasp reflex.
So please note, come test time, what a vestigial structure is, and be able to provide some examples, because they're some of my most favorite, because you literally could observe it on your own body. And the only way to explain why they're there is because it's a window into our evolutionary past. So, coccyx, you want to talk to your friends, evidence of evolution, you can just tell them, hey, we're sitting on it. All right, so last slide. More complex, so rates of evolutionary change may vary. More complex changes typically take longer to evolve. Not surprisingly, as we ratchet up from generation to generation, we could see big changes over long periods of time. But we can see also big changes in relatively short amounts of time when it's due to artificial selection or large changes in the environment. Let's say when a meteorite hits. We'll talk about what happened, how that dramatically influenced rates of evolutionary change when a meteor wiped out the dinosaurs later on in the semester. Also, in artificial selection, when humans intervene and will selectively breed certain animals, you could alter the normal rate of evolutionary change, which is kind of just going in the ebbs and flows of nature. But when humans are selectively breeding certain traits and what we've done with domesticated animals, like the food, a lot of the animals that we breed don't look or behave like their ancestral animal that they originally came from. You could see dramatically acceleration to those rates. So we'll talk a little bit more about the domestication of dogs. They trace their evolutionary origins to back to a wolf ancestor about 20,000 years ago. And then it appears that humans started domesticating them for being more docile and for other traits like hunting, protection, and so forth. So we're going to stop here. This is all I got for Chapter 2. And later this week, I'll post the Chapter 3 lecture as well. Thank you.